All right, well, at the beginning, I'd like to thank the Friday Institute for giving me this honor, the honor of this award, and I appreciate it. And y'all are lucky to be here tonight and not be where I am, and you can get up and leave anytime you get bored. And that's a nice thing to be able to do. The Leandro case started in 1994 in Halifax County with all the little counties, including Bill Harrison was in, the superintendent of Hoke, and they sued the state of North Carolina looking for more money for the poor schools. The state took the position that children in North Carolina, although they had a right to education, did not have a substantive right to any education. And all the state had to do was furnish a school building and a body to teach, and heat and books, and the rest of it was up to the children. Burley Mitchell was Chief Justice, and it got to the Supreme Court, I think, in 96 or 96. And Burley wrote the decision, Leandro won, in which the Supreme Court unanimously found that every child in North Carolina has the right under the Constitution to have the opportunity to a sound basic education. Not that you're going to get one, but that each child has an equal opportunity to have the ability to get a sound basic education. And then they went on to define in 4 major paragraphs what a sound basic education amounts to. And the bottom line that I've now come down after 17 years of doing this to cut it down to the inch is that when you get out of high school, you should be able to read, write, and speak the English language and have an understanding of politics and government, know basic math and sciences. And they listed off the courses that physical science, and you should be able to compete with others in further education, which means, in a nutshell, that when you graduate from high school in North Carolina, you should be able to go to the community college and get in and not take a year of remedial courses, which has largely been the case. You should be able to get in any of our state institutions of higher learning and be able to perform well enough to keep up with all your other students. And if you're going in the job market, which in 1996 we had one, and now everything is high tech, so it's going to take more education, but that you would be able to perform with other people in society and obtain that education so you could get a job. And then they sent the case back to the trial court because they had not taken a single bit of evidence. And that's when Burley Mitchell came to me on the mall in downtown Raleigh on Fayetteville Street one afternoon and said, "Howdy, would you take this school case?" And I said, "Well, anything you want me to do, Chief, I'll do." But I didn't know about it. I'd read about it in the paper. So he said, "Well, you'll probably die or retire with it." And he's right. So I've retired with it. But that was July of 1997. And at that point, we had to go back and do discovery. So the first thing I did was realize it was too big to have all these big school districts involved in litigation. We'd never, ever get it done. So I thought to myself, we'll pick one small county first, one small poor county, because all of the problems in small counties and poor counties are basically going to be the same wherever they happen to be. And so we agreed that we would take Hoke, because Hoke had 5,000 student population, mirror bookend middle schools, one high school, and the rest were elementary schools. And it was small enough to be able to do the discovery about the problems in Hoke County. And we decided we'd put the big city schools, although they could participate in the discovery, we'd put that big city off until we got through this phase of the case. And so the discovery went on quickly, not quickly, but from 97 until 99 when we were ready to start the evidence in the case. So we had one hearing which lasted about 6 weeks, in which we looked at the way the school system was structured, what I call the educational machine, the foundation, the building, was that satisfactory? So we talked about everything in the world, from teacher training to pay scales to how you got licensed to school, how the funding was done, and what came from the counties and what came from the state. When we finished all that, and I had to do that decision, that ended up being about 100 pages. I started in Labor Day weekend and right here on the porch outside, and finished the 1st of October of 2000. And what I found was that the structure, the way we did things structurally, was okay. And the hard question was, how was the court supposed to measure whether children were obtaining a sound basic education? How were we going to measure it? So we had outputs. We had all the scores from reading and math and grades 3 through 8, and then we had the high school scores at that time for all the courses. And so we had outputs that were part of our ABC system. And so I made the decision that North Carolina was a great state, and we had to have level 3, or grade level had to be the marker, that if a child was in level 3, they were obtaining a sound basic education in that course at that period of time in their scholastic life. If you were at 2 or 1, you were not. So the child was not obtaining the constitutional-based education they was entitled to get if they could receive it. And when we did that, the next little decision I made was controversial, because in the course of being on the bench and knowing North Carolina like I know North Carolina, I knew that the children that were living in poverty, or as we called them, at-risk children, were not able to do well in kindergarten because they had 4 years of being in an environment where they weren't getting anything. And I saw enough of that in the criminal system to realize that most of the children that I saw that were now criminals at 19 and 20 got out of school in the 9th grade, and they had no education and they had no start. There was no way they could catch up in kindergarten with 1 year. So I took the stand that we needed to provide a 1 year of pre-K for at-risk 4-year-olds. And I ordered the state to do that. That was not popular. But anyway, I did that. And then the third issue was money. So I did a 20-school system comparison of teacher supplements, size, using the public school forum's great economic survey they put out every year, and realized after doing this step by step that we had a problem everywhere. It just wasn't in Hoke and Halifax and Harnett. It wasn't the little counties. We had a bigger problem in Mecklenburg. They had more children failing to get a sound basic education than they had in the entire system at Hoke. Throwing money at it was not the answer, because the money being there doesn't show that students were doing any better, especially the ones who were at risk. So we had one more set of hearings in the fall of 2001 in which we discussed purely academics, how to do it better. We called the principals in from the schools that had been highlighted. We got educators in, and everybody basically talked about the fact that it could be done if you worked hard. It took a hell of a lot of work, but you could get children who were at risk and in poverty educated up to grade level. And that was the crux of that hearing. And in that came the last order, which they appealed, which basically held that to be Leandro compliant, you had to have a great principal great teacher, and the resources to go with each individual school. It didn't have to be the same thing, but that everybody had to have at least the minimum in every school of resources in which students could obtain a sound basic education. I basically said, if you work hard and roll up your hands, and if you're not performing as a principal, you need to go. But the state is, and I also held that the state is responsible. The state had been taking the position that the school boards are responsible, and the state itself, the legislative branch and executive branch, didn't have the hands-on requirement that they had to meet the standard. And I said the state is responsible. They are the ones that have the ultimate responsibility to determine, to see that this constitutional goal is met. And that went up on appeal. And in 2004, other than the pre-K, I got affirmed 100% by the Supreme Court. So in 2005 and 6, I focused on what I call the high school problem. And they were then doing, the Gates Foundation came in and they were doing the Gates New Schools project. They were talking about doing 9th grade academies. And I did a report on schools, and I basically got so frustrated because Charlotte, Guilford, Winston-Salem, Forsyth, as well as the small poor counties, had horrible high schools. I mean, just terrible high schools in the city of Charlotte and in Durham. So I got angry, and in March of 2006, I wrote the state board a letter, and I had all the data by this point. And I put a list, I think I had 44 schools whose performance composite, these were high schools, whose performance composite was less than 55% and had been so for 5 years in a row. And I said, if the school falls below 55% again, you're not going to open the school next fall unless you put in new management, i.e. your new principal. You have to do something. And I didn't sign an order to that effect, but I just told them that was what was going to happen. So Governor Easley went, in reaction to that, he started the Low Performing Schools Project, which is still going on, the turnaround schools. And that went on beginning in 2006 and still goes on today. About that time, Howard Lee and I started, who was chairman of the state board, and I began traveling together to go to school systems that had problems. I got in the habit of visiting these high schools that were having problems, and I tried to go to every one of them. And I went to Fayetteville, to Harrison, and met Bill Harrison for the first time in the fall of 05, I think. And we went to see the high school that having problems down there, one of them. And we drove out there, and the principal was there, and we had a big tour, and they gave us some cookies from home ec. And I wanted to know where the Plato lab was, which was then something that was really good for the students. So as we walked around, I asked the principal, "Where's your Plato lab? Show me your Plato lab." And she was wearing a red dress, I'll never forget it. And she turned the color of the dress and said, "We don't have it." I said, "Why?" "Because they wouldn't fund it for us." So I said, "I still want to see your Plato lab. You said you have one." So we went to this door and had a big chain around it, and the person from the library center, or what do they call it, came and opened it up, and they had like 50 brand new PCs sitting there not being used because they hadn't paid to have the Plato system put in effect for the year. So I told Bill Harrison, "You'll have a Plato system here, I'm sure, by after Thanksgiving." And they did. So it means you got to go get on the ground to see what's happening. And I bet I visited 30 or 40 high schools, and I just wouldn't tell them, I'd just show up. And that caused a lot of fun. So where are we going from here? I'm out, and I think we're in pretty good shape, except that our children are still not learning to read, and it's an issue of poverty and at-risk kids, and there's still a problem, and there's still a problem everywhere. The court still has to go keep monitoring the scores every year, and we still have to highlight those schools that are not doing well. And I think if there's anything I did that, and I know I made a lot of people angry, is that I would lift up the rock and watch the poor performers and expose to the light. And that, in some ways, is all you can do. Well, I'd ask the new judge to keep looking at the scores every year and keep having hearings and bring up the ones that are not doing well. I think that if they actually, in the classroom, did what Read to Achieve requires in grades K through 3, and also if we expanded pre-K, because the poverty issue has gotten worse, and we have more and more children that are coming from backgrounds that just they're not prepared to succeed when they get to the 5th grade. If we could do that, they'd have a chance.